Hello and welcome to the Bloodstream Podcast, a show serving the greater bleeding disorders community, brought to you by Believe Limited and Bloodstream Media and made possible thanks to our presenting sponsor, Takeda. I'm your patient advocate and host, Patrick James Lynch.
And I am your healthcare advocate, nonprofit nerd, Marriott specialist,
yes, you
Amy
are.
Board, reminding you to speak to a healthcare professional before making any treatment decisions.
You are a Marriott specialist.
We're in a Marriott right now, everyone.
We're in the Marriott
I'm wearing
River
a
Center.
lanyard.
You are. An orange lanyard, which means maybe I'm good with contact. Maybe I want some social distance, because that's a part of what we're doing here, which is being a part of HFA's 2022 Symposium, which involves lanyards that have some color coordination as to help people know if they can touch other people.
I just chose the orange because of the Denver Bronco colors, and I just automatically choose orange.
I
also,
100% believe you, but I actually 100% believe you that it was more motivated by your Denver Broncos love than anything to do with health and safety.
Yeah.
And I respect that. We're here. We're in San Antonio, Texas. We're at the Marriott River Center, which I learned the hard way is different than the Marriott River Walk.
Same. Did your Uber take you to our Uber took us to the wrong hotel?
Oh, no, my feet did it. I just walked into the wrong hotel, and people were coming in as they were leaving as I walked in, so I didn't have to use my key. I got onto an elevator somehow. I've done this in other places as well, where I'm on the 14th floor, and I was like, my room number isn't on this floor. Where's my room number? And so I realized, oh no, I'm in the hotel across the street. And they were like, oh, you're in the River Center. And I was like, oh, this is the River Walk.
Let me tell you, that happens a lot. There are different Marriotts all in the same city block in so many cities. I just want to know what was behind that.
Marriott, could you maybe do a little more work? You've got different brands. Could we maybe do a little more to differentiate one hotel from another? But that is not why we are here.
No.
Though we are here in a Marriott. But we are in San Antonio for HFA Symposium. You know that we've been previewing this for a few weeks, and we've had a few amazing conversations. Today, you're going to hear our conversation with Adar Cohen, who's the keynote speaker. We're recording this on Thursday, the 21st. And this episode is going to come out tomorrow. Adar's keynote is in a couple of hours. So we haven't heard it yet. No one has. By the time you hear this episode, it'll be out. But when we speak to Adar in the interview you're about to hear, you'll just note that we haven't heard his keynote yet. But my goodness, we got, I think, an amazing sneak preview from him.
My goodness. I mean, I don't want to I don't know, make it a big deal, but I loved my conversation with him yesterday. Our conversation, I should say. You were there.
It was like, oh, wow, okay. Sorry. I mean, we do take some of these, solo, but I was 3 inches from your right shoulder.
Brutal, everyone. Brutal, listeners. Brutal. We were both together, but no, it was great. He's absolutely wonderful, and you're going to get a great listen today.
What struck you? What so moved you about the conversation?
Well, I think, his whole life's work has been around difficult conversations and conflict resolution. And that is fascinating to me as a child of a counselor, a marriage counselor. And of course, my dad's, done that for over 40, almost 50 years. And growing up in that, I never heard the words conflict resolution, but relational, conversations, kind of leaning into those bigger, difficult conversations has been something that I've at least had an idea about since I was a kid. And so to hear him speak in this way, to have studied it, and then I think he just had a different way of framing things that I really respected. So I think he built
his own degree in college. How cool is that?
Yeah.
So that's coming up in just a few moments and will be the majority of this episode. We previously said we'd have both him and Xander Masser, the other keynote speaker, on today's episode. But Amy and I huddled up with our team here. We got the Bloodstream team in the room. We got Keith's in the room, James is in the room, Jose and Rob. Rob is staring at his computer very diligently. He's probably doing something really important right now, but he is in the room. Everybody's here. But we had a little huddle up. The interviews were so good and rich that we didn't want to cut them down into half their size, but at the same time, we didn't want to send you a 2.5-hour episode. So you'll have Adar on this episode, as well as our Let's Talk segment, the first in this new season from Joshua Bragg, made possible thanks to our partner on that, Sanofi. Shout out to Sanofi. And next week, we're going to have another pop-up episode because, we are every other week, except also whenever else we want to do an episode. So there'll be an episode on the 29th of April. That will feature the conversation with Xander and a little bit of other stuff. So Adar in a little while. And then after that, we'll have the Let's Talk segment with Josh, again, made possible by Sanofi. And of course, dear listeners, the Bloodstream podcast in general is made possible thanks to our presenting sponsor, Takeda. Amy?
What?
Takeda's got this website.
I knew it.
bleedingdisorders.com, where you can learn all about Takeda's resources for and commitment to the bleeding disorders community. That website, one more time, is bleedingdisorders.com for wherever on the journey you may be, bleedingdisorders.com. And for their founding and ongoing support of the Bloodstream podcast, I would just like to say thanks, Takeda.
Thanks, Takeda.
Adar Cohen, he is a mediator. He has led conversations in conflict zones, family rooms, and other places where people can say
Just wanted to make that clear. It's the same thing.
Northern Ireland and Ireland, the family room, same level of strife.
Same level of stress.
But as he puts it, and he has led these conversations in other places where people can save the world. He'll share more about his worldview in just a few minutes. His work's been featured by the New York Times, TED Ideas, MSNBC, and beyond. He's got a bunch of other interesting credits to his name that come up across our conversation. So without further delay, let's get to that conversation. This was Amy and we did it together.
We did it together.
Two of us there the whole time.
My bad.
With Adar Cohen. All right, Amy and I are now joined by one of the keynote speakers of HFA Symposium. His name is Adar Cohen. Adar, welcome. Thanks for joining us here on Bloodstream.
Thank you, Patrick. Happy to be here. Hi, Amy.
Hello. We're so excited you're here.
Thank you.
So I really enjoyed listening to your TEDx speech and doing a little bit of reading on you to prepare for this conversation. It's also interesting to me that your keynote is happening tomorrow. So it has not happened yet. So we don't have the benefit. We have the excitement of anticipating it, but not the benefit of what actually is going to be said. Listeners will hear this after it's taken place. So we won't spend too much time on previewing it because it's already happened. But can you give us the gist of what is your keynote about?
I'm interested in my core belief, the belief that drives all of my work in the world, is that there's nothing that influences our future more than conversations. And I'm not talking about the mundane ones, and I'm not even really talking about the most pleasant ones. I'm talking about the difficult ones, the ones we avoid.
Yeah.
Whether or not we're willing to have those, and then how we have them, I think says everything about who we are as individuals, as families, as organizations, as communities. And even more than saying who we are, I think how we approach and deal with and work through difficult conversations says a lot about who we're becoming and what we're becoming. So for me, being at the table with people as they tend to difficult, complicated, awkward, uncomfortable issues, it's a privilege for me because I think it's really important work, and I keep learning from people as they show me some of the ways to do that gracefully and effectively and sustainably. The talk will be about difficult conversations and how we continue to come together rather than to move apart.
Give our audience a little bit of your experience with difficult conversations, because you've been a part of difficult conversations in some pretty unique and stressful environments.
I have. Going back to the beginning of my career, I worked in conflict resolution and international way in Northern Ireland, in the Middle East. I've also done work with law enforcement and gangs, labor and management, and also family mediation. Sometimes the most profound and the most painful division and conflict happens inside of families for obvious reasons.
Sure.
Families working out of estrangement or trying to process some great transformation that they've experienced. It's hard. It's emotional. So I do a lot of different work with people and organizations and groups in different stages of transition, transformation, and sometimes crisis.
And where did this start? Where did this interest in conflict resolution come from?
Patrick, I should have a good answer to that by now. The truth is that
something packaged.
Right. The truth is that it's not easy for me to say. I can tell you that I grew up in a working class household with my grandparents on one side are refugees. They fled Iran for Israel. On that side of my family, we are Persian Jews. On the other side of my family, Danish extraction
Okay.
from New Hampshire by way of Nova Scotia. And my parents, in my house, there was just a lot represented. So Persian, Jewish, Danish, rural. I'm the first in my family to go to college. There was a lot going on in my house that my sense wasn't really going on in some of my friends' houses growing up.
Interesting.
I grew up in rural New Hampshire. And so I was, there were relatives from the Middle East coming often, and our house was sort of a haven for the small number of Afghanis and Persians and other Middle Easterners who were in New Hampshire. Our Thanksgiving dinner looked like a subcommittee of the United Nations.
Interesting.
And so I was just party to a lot of really dynamic and I think valuable conversations from a young age.
Yes.
And so I think I absorbed a lot of that and had a lot of questions about about what all of that meant. And I wouldn't have, and so, coming up in high school, it wasn't a given for me that I would go to college. That wasn't my plan. It wasn't something that my parents had done.
What was your plan?
My plan was to go into the family business with my dad.
Which is what?
Restoration and repair of hand-woven Oriental carpets.
Wow.
So
we'd be having a whole nother kind of conversation right now.
Yeah, that would be a different, which is also a great conversation. I love rugs a lot more than most of the next.
I would imagine we could have a longer conversation about rugs than most guests.
That's right.
Yeah,
we'll
for
do
the rug
that.
special.
So I'll tell you about the 1920s Persian serape with hand-spun wool and vegetable dyes. But I think so that was my path, and it was a couple of high school teachers who caught wind of that and stepped in my way and said, "Hey, listen, this isn't going to fly. You've got to rethink this."
Because they saw something in you.
I guess so. I mean, I was, I had questions, and I think when you're curious and you have questions, this gets back to conflict resolution. And even when you don't feel immediately curious, can you find a way to curiosity and inquiry? I think I went to college, it turns out. And that was, once I got there, I realized, wow, a lot of these concerns I've had and wonderings about how is it that people can sometimes successfully talk and connect across great difference?
Yeah.
That is so special.
Yeah.
How come sometimes it works and how come sometimes it doesn't? And why does it sometimes go so horribly bad when it doesn't? And is there a world in which I could do that? That became that's how it started.
So was it the end of high school then? Is it when you were asking yourself, is there a world where I could play a role in this in some way? Is that the end of high school for you?
It's really the beginning of college, I think.
Okay.
And the realization that there's actually, you can do this for a living. And my college, which was wonderful for me in every way. Really, I got so much support there. Wheaton College in Massachusetts, very, very special.
Got it. Okay.
Very special place for me. There wasn't a conflict resolution major, but they let me design one. They let me build one.
Wow.
With the help of 4 different departments and the chairs of those departments really meeting me where I was and trying to create an interdisciplinary major that I could, build and then pursue.
Good for them.
So that's how I graduated with a bachelor's degree in conflict resolution.
So, and you're the first graduate of Wheaton College with this degree, I would imagine?
Actually, there was one several years before me who actually designed, not quite the same one, but something similar that had to do with interfaith dialogue.
Interesting.
So you can see Wheaton's openness to fostering students'
and
curiosity.
Curiosity.
Yeah.
That's so great.
Now, Trinity College in Dublin is what you liked college so much you decided to do extra. You have a PhD from Trinity College in Dublin, if I'm not mistaken, in conflict resolution, yes?
That's right.
Why Trinity College? Why Dublin? Why Ireland?
Well, the faculty, Trinity is a wonderful university, but really it's the Irish School of Ecumenics, a school within Trinity that has a rich tradition in mediation, conflict resolution, ecumenical dialogue, interfaith dialogue.
Is that what does ecumenical mean?
Ecumenical means, sort of exchange and talk across sects and faiths.
Good word.
Yeah.
I learned a great word just now.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a great word.
And many of the faculty members in that program at Trinity had been involved in the Good Friday peace process that brought really one of the most successful peace agreements we know of in history to the island of Ireland. And it was a huge, what a privilege to study under them. And also I had the support of a wonderful scholarship that supported me in being able to complete those studies. And
got it.
The Mitchell Scholarship, which is just a really fabulous program that supports, I think 10 or so U.S. students each year to go and study with a lot of support at any university on the island of Ireland.
Wow. That's really neat.
Yeah.
So I want to transition a little bit to talking about what's brought Adar to HFA Symposium. Before I do that, I do want to ask you about the rules that guide the big conversations we have to have. So I'm really intrigued by your core belief, I suppose, that there are these necessary conversations. How do we approach them? How do we think about them? If I'm in it, does that mean I have to lead it? If I'm leading it, what's helping me guide that? How do you answer these questions? How do we approach the biggest, most necessary, but often so difficult conversations?
And you alluded before we began that these shift all the time, which I just think is such a beautiful. I trust your thoughts and your opinions because they move so much, because you don't have anything concrete. So I'd wonder if you speak to that as well. It's
Thank
really
you.
great.
Yeah, I would be happy to. I think anytime you hear these are the 3 simple rules to, right?
I was going to make a bit, but I didn't want to.
No, we should be skeptical. We should be. I am.
Yeah.
And so anytime people ask me to do it, and that's just what a TED Talk does, is you're supposed to distill it down to here are the 3 things you should never do when your boss is whatever. And great that it's inviting and engages people, but I do think it's important to stay open to how these things evolve and shift. The world is changing so rapidly.
I bet.
So mine though, with that disclaimer out of the way, right now I'm working with here are 4 reminders for people, whether they're trying to sit down for a difficult conversation at home with a loved one, or with someone they haven't had contact with for a long time, or with someone they work with every day at the office, or someone that they serve in some kind of together in some civic capacity. 4 things to keep in mind. The first one is, if you have a conflict or a difficult conversation you've been avoiding, or that you need to have, I think it's really important to set the conversation apart. And what that looks like in 2022 is really to schedule it, to get it on someone's calendar. And this is important for a number of reasons. The first one is, and the most important, if the conversation is volatile or uncertain or risky, better to start from a calm and steady place rather than that day where in the heat of the moment it finally spills over and you end up talking about it because you couldn't take it anymore, or someone lost their cool or something bad happened. That conversation never goes well. So we set it apart, schedule in advance.
Even in marriages?
Even in marriages. Yeah. And now people ask me, isn't this awkward? This is so uncomfortable. You want to telegraph to the person, and isn't there going to be a lot of dread and squeamishness and worry about this coming up? And that's not comfortable, but I still think it's better than waiting for the conversation to just sneak up on you and rarely go well in that way. So set it apart, give everyone an equal footing to know, okay, we're talking about it this day, this time, and choose the venue together. Everyone knows what to expect. That's the first one. The second one is to come prepared with questions. First of all, questions. Questions are how we put ourselves in a position of inquiry and curiosity, even if we're not in curious mood.
I love that. I do not do that. I come prepared with my points.
You come with your points and your grievances that you
Right.
want to be heard on.
Right.
And that's important. You should be heard in your conversation. But the way humans work is they're not really ready to listen deeply until they feel like they've been heard.
Huh.
Right? But this is a catch-22 because both are feeling that way.
Right.
So who's going to break the cycle of not hearing and not listening and start the cycle of listening and hearing? Someone's got to do it. So I guess my call to action to people is like, go ahead and be that person. And here's, if you're not in an idealistic or generous mood about it, and you don't feel like your person that you're thinking about right now as I talk, most people have a difficult conversation. You've already populated it.
No.
If you don't feel like they really deserve that, that's fine. Set aside the idealism or the generosity for them and just remind yourself, this is your quickest route to being heard, is to listen to the other person first. And the way to do that is to ask them open-ended questions. And an open-ended question is one that isn't like answerable in a yes or a no, right?
Sure.
Great, but it has to be open-ended in a special way. It can't be, what were you thinking when you, we want the open-ended question to sincerely invite your counterpart to share their thoughts, their feelings, their hopes, their concerns.
What does the "what were you thinking when" question? What does that do?
What I meant, I should have said it with more of an edge in my voice. It's like the what's wrong with you?
Kind of
like
thing.
I had a client once, right? We were building the questions out before their conversation, and one of their questions was, I really want to know is, what is wrong with you? Right? That's not going to do but it's not going to do the trick that we're talking about. So, build those questions in advance, because sometimes people think, I can ask my person questions.
Yeah.
I can ask them some questions, and they expect to be able to come up with them on the spot in the moment, which is totally unreasonable.
Yeah.
It's not fair to themselves.
Yeah.
We can't. We're faced with that person. Everything starts to heat up and everything starts to speed up, and really good, sincere, open-ended questions, they're not available in that environment. So we come up with them in advance and write them down and come with them on the paper or the screen. No problem. People say to me, like, isn't that also sort of, that's weird. Going to come with a list of questions. It sort of feels canned or hokey, and like, not at all. Far from it. A person is going to feel, wow, you're telling me you put the forethought ahead of our conversation to write down the questions that you wanted to ask me so that I would have a chance to tell you what I'm concerned about or hoping for or afraid of. It's a gift.
Yeah.
And it's a gift to the asker too, because then you don't have to ask from behind the 8 ball. So you start asking those open-ended questions, and then this isn't a shocker. You listen. Yeah. You listen to the answers. You don't listen for looking for a solution. You don't listen to refute. You don't listen through the lens of your own grievance. That's all going to come. Trust that that's later. First, you just listen more deeply and for a little bit longer than you'd like.
And what does that mean?
That means as soon as you start to feel uncomfortable and feel like, you know what, I'm giving away the whole shop here. I'm listening to everything that they're saying, and they're not going to listen to me. And I'm listening, and they think that I agree. They think that my listening is assent.
Yeah, I've been in that position.
It's not necessarily the case. We can remind ourselves, listening is a gift that we give to a person. It doesn't necessarily entail agreeing or buying what they're selling. Yeah. It just means that we think that this other human being deserves to have their positions heard. Not even just positions, but their experiences.
Right. So is that rule 3, the listening piece?
Yeah, rule 3 is the listening. Yeah, listen for longer than you think. And if you do that, if you do that deeply enough, and if you can even find it in yourself to ask a couple of follow-up questions when they're deep in it. This is going to be when you least feel like asking them a follow-up question.
Sure.
Because you're going to be saturated by it. But can you find some curiosity about what they're experiencing and ask just that one more question?
And why? What's that follow-up? What does that do?
Because then they know that distinguishes it's just a way to go deeper and to show the person that there's true concern and curiosity.
Got it.
And then the person is going to feel heard and seen. And what will happen is something will come over them. I don't know what to call this yet, but it's a kind of, and I mean, it's unmistakable. It's like many of the muscles in the face relax at the same time, and the person almost looks like someone else.
I've had that experience.
Have you?
When I've noticed when people open up sometimes that almost instantaneously, their entire face just looks different. So that sounds related to what you're talking about.
It's like you go from like talking about taxes to asking a person about their pet.
Yeah.
Right? The face is going to change a lot. It's like that.
Yeah.
My dad calls it the heart softening.
Oh.
You know, like there's been something hard there, you know, that you're trying to penetrate through, or there's a defense mechanism. And my dad will say, you know, it's like a heart softening.
That's really tender.
Yeah.
So that's
rule 3. You listen. You listen for longer than you think you should. And then that moment hopefully will happen.
Yeah.
And people think this magic stuff, it's happening all the time in my work. I'm seeing it all the time. And it's a really wonderful thing when it does, because what will happen to that person who's just been given that gift of feeling heard is that something will come over them, and they are now, it's prime time. They are ready to listen to you in a way that they weren't before, and in a way that they won't be 30 minutes from then. So you have a window. And if the person doesn't naturally, of their own volition, say, hey, you know what? Thank you for listening to me. You know, can I ask you? Right? If they don't initiate themselves, which most people will, but that's okay if they don't, because there's this nice move where the person who's been asking and generously listening sees that it's starting to work and can cue them, can prompt them if they haven't done it themselves, and say, hey, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for sharing all that you've shared with me. It's been really meaningful for me to hear what is concerning you, what you're hoping for, whatever it is that they've shared. It's meaningful for me to listen. And I wonder if it would be useful to you if I would also share some of what I'm thinking about, right? And show me the person on this planet who after being heard in that deep and sustained way, and then given that generous prompt, isn't going to think, oh yeah, it's time for me to reciprocate.
Right.
And they're going to be reciprocating in that magic zone.
Yeah.
Where they've released their grip on narratives and positionality. They're so much more ready to really absorb what your experience has been. And so then you can tell what's going on. You can answer some of their questions, or you can go, Amy, to those grievances that you wanted to get out, that you need to get out.
Yeah.
And I think there, the reminder is, see if you can prepare yourself before the conversation to figure out, what are my top 3?
Yeah.
What are my top 3? Because I have a limited amount of time.
Yeah.
We've already spent a lot of time listening.
Yeah.
Blood sugar, the clock, things are working against us.
Yeah.
Let me not go up with numbers 8 and 9 on the list. That's not a good use of this magic time.
Yeah.
Stay in the top 3.
Yeah.
Where you really need to be heard. And then number 4, rule 4 is silence. And it's can we embrace silence for the asset that it is in difficult conversations? And this is counterintuitive. It goes against our nature. I think it goes against our nervous system. When we encounter silence, all around the world, there's a tendency for people to tense up and assume the worst about even the briefest pause. They're judging me. They don't like this. They have bad thoughts about me. This is awkward. This is tense. Awkward, right? We're hypersensitive about silence.
Yes.
In fact, in my work as a mediator, I find that again and again, the best moments, breakthrough moments where a person says, you know what? After years, maybe, you know what? The way I'm hearing this right now, and just things are clicking for me in a new way. And I just want to say, I think I got some of this stuff wrong. And I think I want to say that I'm sorry. That never happens in a fast moment,
right?
A fast exchange,
right?
That's always preceded by a pause,
right?
A pause that feels a lot longer to the mediator or the other people at the table than it actually is.
Yes.
Right? Because we're so used to the tension. But silence is an asset, and good things happen after silence. So what I'm trying to remind people is not to squander that, and find a way to endure it if you can, because good things can happen, especially if you've done any of these other first 3 steps. Silence is your friend at that point. So the idea there is to just give people the time they need and see if you can calm yourself with it and see if you can project some kind of calm, even if you're not really feeling it yourself. Because I don't always, when I'm in the hot seat, if I'm working with people who are at odds, silence is tough.
Yeah.
Silence is really tough. I stay with it because I know and I've seen what it can yield.
Wow.
Adar, I have a question for you. Is everyone capable of this? Or are there some people that are just too self-centered to be able to do this?
It's a good question, Amy.
Good job, Amy.
You've asked the question that maybe a lot of people were thinking, and that I think about, frankly, a lot, because, and I continue to be an optimistic person, and I do think that everyone has this in them somewhere, and I think that sometimes the people who, for whom it's farthest away, they might be the ones who have the greatest needs for listening and being heard. And at the same time, there are sometimes people who make it hardest on others to sit and listen. I don't know. I don't know. Probably not. Let's be real. Probably not. But I think the vast, vast majority are ready for this.
Yeah.
And, I keep finding that even in really tough situations where, there's often one person who,
right.
the group says, that person's the problem. Talk to everyone and they'll all tell you in some form or other, it's really that person. Oftentimes in my work, I'm meeting one-on-one with everyone who's party to the mediation process. And, oftentimes they just need to be heard in a certain way or a new way.
Yeah.
Or they've been heard. People have been listening to them over and over again, but they just haven't found their way to acknowledge the fact that people are listening. It hasn't clicked. Finding a way to get it to click.
Yeah.
But the answer is, I don't know.
Oh, that's fair. Yeah. I just think as humans, we are built to relate. And so even if there are, relationships or situations that might be difficult, I just think it's the just wonderful thing about, this is getting super sappy, but I think it's the most wonderful thing about humanity is this and pushing into this. So I just really respect your work. And I love the word curiosity.
Yeah.
I just, I don't know what it is, but that word is so intriguing and engaging to me, to have curiosity about someone else. I have another question. I have a follow-up.
Go for it.
PJ, you started this work years ago. I don't want to age it, but you started this work years ago. What has it been like coming into this political unrest, I should say, in our country? Coming, here in the last, a little under a decade. What has that been like? What's that been like for your work? What have you noticed in families? I'm just wondering if there's been a shift in your work and what you've seen.
Yeah, I'm noticing people are either low on patience, or they're acting as though they are. And it takes great effort to create the conditions in which people are willing to do the work of listening to one another, because it isn't effortless or passive. It's really hard work to listen to someone when every fiber of your being disagrees, or even finds what they're saying hurtful or revolting. And but it's the act of listening through that actually brings us together. I think there's this myth, and I think sometimes it's harmful, that conflicts can be resolved, which sounds like I'm kind of turning we went this whole way just to hear you say that. All right. It does, but let me explain. I think, sure, some of them can be, but the ones that are worth their salt, they don't get resolved. They get dissolved through listening. People, you can't go to the list of grievances and slights and hurts and offenses between let's say, a divorcing couple, it's too immense to ever go item by item and resolve each issue. If that divorcing couple is trying to figure out, we're separating, but we still want to co-parent well together.
Mm-hmm.
They don't need to resolve all of those issues. They need to essentially dissolve the conflict that would get in their way. And that doesn't happen by litigating every issue and trying to figure out like wins and losses, make two columns. No, it's to listen in such a way that all of that people can relax and lose the tight grip they have on those positions.
Yeah.
And that dissolution really happens through engagement and listening, which fosters empathy and curiosity,
right,
and connectedness, even across great difference and disagreement.
Right. Wow.
I love that thought of that it's not resolved, it's dissolved.
Yeah.
That's actually, that's a shift.
Well, and what I like about a lot of what you're sharing, Adar, and we only have you for a few more minutes, but I do want to say before I do,
Which is a bummer. I have like 17 more questions.
I know, but I think that's Adar Cohen. You can check out his work online. There'll be links in the program notes. He's got a book. Tell us a little bit. I wrote down the title of it here. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Jimmy Lee and James? Is that the correct title?
That's the title.
What's the book about?
That's about two civil rights activists who died 2 weeks apart from one another in 1965 during the push toward voting rights for African Americans. And it's about their communities and the foot soldiers of the civil rights movement and how they created a coalition that nonviolently answered to a system of, racial domination and subjugation and marginalization of African Americans in this country, and achieved the right to vote. So it follows the efforts of Jimmy Lee Jackson and James Reeb. It isn't about mediation. It's about people coming together to achieve something extraordinary for democracy and doing that without the use of violence.
Well, and speaking of that, to give you a moment to speak to this as well, you're a co-founder of the Civic Leadership Foundation. The title gives a certain sense of what the mission may be, but would you mind sharing the mission?
Civic Leadership Foundation is a nonprofit based in Chicago that works with young people who have the deck stacked against them, and many of whom are facing great difficulty just as young kids coming up. And the idea of CLF, Civic Leadership Foundation, is what if we created the space and the tools where they could experience themselves as leaders and their communities could experience the ideas and the passion and the hope and the concern that they have for their neighbors. What would happen if, classroom by classroom, school by school, neighborhood by neighborhood, eventually city by city, I hope, young people are put in a leadership role and empowered to, be the change that they hope to see in the world. That's an organization that I was involved in getting started and worked with for 15 years.
Wow.
And I'm still closely involved and an avid supporter of their efforts.
And did I read, is this correct, that there's over 25,000 young leaders who have been helped by the foundation?
That's true over the last 15 years, and that number continues to climb.
It's really, really impressive. So then lastly, with the couple of moments that we have remaining, what brought you to San Antonio for the Hemophilia Federation of America's Symposium?
Great question.
Took me a while to get there, but I figured I should probably ask.
We got families, we got teenagers.
You can ask Sharon and Anne and Heather, all of whom they've become my partners in this work. We are learning together how to build and foster really good conversations when it matters most. And I didn't work with them in a mediation capacity, but in a sort of optimization capacity. We've got really big questions we need to answer. There's a lot of people counting on the work that HFA does. How do we want to talk, and what do we want to talk about, and where do we want to go? Those are big questions. So I've been a partner with them in trying to ask and ask some of them.
Very cool. Well, I'll say too that from the sessions that I've attended so far, this is day one of Symposium, there is this theme around the big conversations. How do we express? How do we listen to each other? How do we understand one another? So I'm imagining there's a nice runway to your keynote tomorrow and a cohesiveness, it seems, to the theme. And, Amy, to a point you made about the upheaval that it feels as though it's a part of our day-to-day societal existence to some degree. It just feels like the timing of this is excellent from my vantage point anyway. As Amy said, Adar, we could keep doing this for a long time, but we have things to get to. So we will release you back to the wild here in San Antonio, but not before saying thank you so much for being here. As someone with hemophilia, thank you for investing in our community and coming to this meeting to lead this discussion and encourage us to lead our own discussions where we need to. And I'm really looking forward to tomorrow.
Thank you both. It's been great talking with you, Amy and Patrick. Thank you.
Absolutely.
You're welcome. Listeners, I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you again to Adar, who I also learned as soon as the microphones went off. Amy, you learned it too. Basketball fan.
Which is huge, as listeners know. Patrick was psyched.
NBA basketball equals Taylor Swift in terms of how to relate to these podcast hosts outside of bleeding disorders.
I mean, just small. I'm just going to get it in there. You've talked about basketball with a lot of guests over the years with Bloodstream, and I don't think I've talked about Taylor Swift to anybody. Which
you have opportunities every time the microphone is on.
It's true.
Or you're a more disciplined podcast host than I am. We'll have to debate that offline.
None of our guests really strike me as Tay fans, but now I'm going to start to look for it.
You don't know until you ask.
It's fair.
I didn't think that Adar Cohen was going to be like, I need to get out of here to make it for tip-off of the next Celtics game. And then I was like, Adar, I love you more. I didn't know it was possible. Very cool figure. It was. I'm so glad he's here.
Yes.
And something that was very clear to me in talking with him, Amy, was the theme of this conference, this Texas-sized family reunion, and having important conversations in our families, in our advocacy work, being a leader in those conversations. There's a consistency in the theme of this meeting that I want to acknowledge and give HFA a shout out for. And I think Adar is no small part of that. So thank you again, Adar, for sharing. Check out his work. His TEDx is a really interesting 15-minute talk. He shares some things along the lines of what he shared today, of course, but there's a lot of different stuff in there too. So I'd recommend checking that out. And again, Jimmy Lee and James, the book, Civic Leadership Foundation, Adar Cohen. If you want to check out his website, there'll be a link in the program notes. Amy, what are we going into next?
What are we going into next?
Let's talk.
Let's talk. And we're excited because we're kicking off a second year and a fresh approach to the Let's Talk segment.
A fresh approach indeed.
Sorry, that's a lot.
The tongue twister. It's a little early for me.
Let's Talk is a partnership between Bloodstream Media and Sanofi, and it aims to create an environment where we can have open, honest conversations about mental health in the bleeding disorders community.
Adar would approve.
I agree. Let's Talk strives to shine light on these topics that are often invisible and not spoken about in the community, and shares tips on how we can care for you or a loved one's mental health. If you or someone you know has experienced feelings that have impacted your mental health, talk to your healthcare provider and find educational resources at letstalkmh.com. Sanofi is proud to sponsor this podcast segment because they believe that each of us has a story. Visit shareyourwhy.com to meet the Sanofi core team and hear from them and members of the community about their story and passion for the hemophilia community. Now let's get on with this week's Let's Talk segment.
I'm sick. I'm not dying. But whatever part of my brain tells me how to complain in the most dramatic of ways keeps telling me that I am. It's a chest cold. After 2 years of being cautious around COVID and working from home and masking when I should, I got very used to being well. And then last week I got some pretty serious carpal tunnel syndrome that I had to treat. And as soon as that went away, I got this chest cold, and it has been miserable. I'm very much okay. 2 vibrant orange Dayquil and a Ricola seem to handle most of the symptoms, but what they can't seem to brush under the medication rug is this feeling of mortality that lingers in every deep cough, every sore knuckle, in every tired sigh, runny nose, and watery eye. I can't seem to shake it. This awareness that this body is temporary and that someday I'm going to die. But some people I talked to recently say that's actually a good thing. Let's talk.
I'm Heather, and I work as a death doula.
And I'm Carter. I own and run a small production studio in New York.
We were introduced while I was doing my death doula study, and we both had some significant loss in the months and year before we met. So I lost my dad in April of 2020, and Carter lost his mom in April of 2019.
Yeah, 2019.
Yeah, so it was an interesting thing to come together because he had some ideas and projects that he was working on related to footage with his mom. And then the fact that I was going through a death study and also was in the first few months of experiencing parental loss as well was a really interesting way for our friendship to develop, because a lot of stuff comes up when you're like, hey, let's talk about death in general. And then you're also simultaneously experiencing and processing very intimate loss that way.
I met Heather and Carter through a connection with E2AC, a nonprofit organization that helps out independent entertainment properties who are looking to affect change in the world. Their project is called Death Differently.
I think over the last 6 months, it's really taken shape to really focus on highlighting stories of individuals and organizations who are approaching death differently. People in spaces that are doing things maybe a little bit outside of that traditional path, and highlighting people that are focusing on bringing death awareness earlier, and how that can inform better living, more informed living, and choices about how we can live our lives more fully with the knowledge that death is inevitable and a part of what we have to offer in being born.
I was going to say, and I have a mad delay, so I'm also going to do this.
Oh, right. Jessica was there too, in the same room as me. So we had to get creative with our headphones to deal with the echo.
When thinking about chronic illness and how often there is trauma and recovery, the idea of thinking about mortality comes up a bit more frequently than in like 100% perfect health existence. So there is a sort of, if there's a gift in talking about death, chronic illness, there's a gift in the access point to talking about mortality.
There's a lot of the way that I look at life and death is for my own personal self through the lens of like Buddhist philosophy, right? In those practices, you're meant to meditate on death once a day, every day, because there is a benefit, because there is a quickening of life when you are willing to talk about death. Even in the most difficult circumstances, there's usually some kind of medicine in that situation, right? So chronic illness, there is a benefit to having the idea of the mortality of your being in your awareness every day, because the concept of perfectly well people who are not consciously thinking about death means they're likely not consciously thinking about the quality of their life in the same way. And yeah, I would say that there's a little bit more of a quality of being awake when you have to be present with your body in every moment versus not.
I'm terrified of that because I come from a place where I think I spent a lot of time in New York contemplating, when you're an artist, you have these like big thoughts of like, I want my work to have meaning and I want to have it mean something once I'm gone. And so those thoughts very quickly swirl into life is going too fast. I'm going to die too soon, and I have experienced, especially as someone who also experiences seasonal depression, periods of time where like the work slows down, life slows down, it's darker, and I'm just literally, I cannot stop thinking about death. So the last thing I want to do is to jump into a daily practice of recognizing death. But from someone who just took therapy for 6 months for the first time in their life, I understand how it can benefit me. So how does a person, how as a death doula or as people who work in this space, how do you encourage people to take that first step?
I think part of it is being willing to investigate your fear, right? Like curiosity is both one of the best tools that you can have to move forward with something, but it also acts as a shield to the difficult parts of something, right? Because when you're engaged in this space of asking questions, you don't have to know the answers, right? And so it's really fun kind of to explore your fear through that lens, because you're like, what's going to be around the next bend? It's a little bit like walking through a haunted house, where it's like, something's going to jump out and scare the shit out of you. And you kind of want to see what the next thing is going to be. And that's very much what like meditation is, right? Like just being like, what's my mind going to deliver to me around this next moment? And when you've given your mind a topic to let it sort of move around, it can reveal all of these interesting things. And to recognize that like none of us know. I've yet to meet anyone who survived death. So there is no one who knows what this is all going to be like. But if I can say like, what is it that I'm afraid of? Usually the first answer is this big block letter word, death. And then you're like, okay, well, what about that am I afraid of? Right? Is it the suffering? Is it an extended discomfort? Is it pain? Is it the unknown? Because you start to realize that underneath this umbrella of topics, there are all of these little tendrils of other things that have disguised themselves as this one massive topic. And what's cool is that when you start to just pull one of those single threads, it starts to reveal to you, what am I doing or not doing in my daily life that either reinforces that fear or is keeping me from making me avoid interacting with that? And sometimes what am I doing or not doing that's actually taking away the quality of life that I do have in this moment? And so that can be fun.
Yeah, that's what I'm really curious about, is because I think people who live with chronic pain, people who live with a disorder that maybe because of the time that they were born, their medicine wasn't available to them until they were a little bit older. And so they have, long lasting permanent joint problems. And then there are the people from, who lived through the 1980s who were infected through their medicine and now live with HIV, hepatitis, and hemophilia. I feel like there's a lot of weight to that already. And I'm really curious about, like, again, and maybe it's just because I haven't been able to wrap my mind around it yet, but that idea of like, okay, I'm going to look at these darker things and that's going to cheer me up, like that's going to have a positive effect. I don't know if I'm just asking the same question again either,
I find it interesting that we tend to want to lump all these things into one category of pain, suffering, illness, dying, and death. And the caveat, I'm not a death professional. I've just approached this from the perspective of someone who has had questions. And every single time that I've dived into conversations with people who are death professionals or who are struggling with long-term illness, with death being the inevitability at maybe a quicker pace than what a healthy individual, quote unquote, would be dealing with. It's interesting to tear apart where we lump things into with each other. Pain is different than death and what we fear around death, and because we tend to put them on this one path that I'm sick, therefore, and then with the inevitability of death, it's been interesting to tear apart and see what people's responses have been to separating the differences that they feel about their fears around pain and suffering and the physical body going through that awful experience versus the cessation of life and what that looks like from their perspective. Tearing apart those internal myths, at least for myself, has been interesting. And like Heather and I have had long conversations around where these lines are for ourselves, where our fears lie with pain, because pain is something that I fear, that I do not want to experience that. But death is something that I have questions about that don't necessarily fall in line with pain and suffering.
We talked for over an hour with Heather and Carter, and this portion I've shared with you today barely scratches the surface of the conversation. But I think it's enough to chew on for right now. Death is scary. And Carter is right. We lump a lot of different feelings into that word and the feelings surrounding that word. I'm suffering a bit right now with this gosh darn chest cold, struggling to speak. My body feels weak and I have this weird neck pain from laying on one side too long to try and drain my left nostril enough to fall asleep for another 30 minutes. And the most pathetic part of my brain, the ultimate complainer hidden in the dark shadows, tends to whisper in times like these, "You are going to die someday." And I violently push that thought away. Not me. Not this guy, but there's a danger in that. A lot of danger when you really get curious about it. Not accepting that death is a part of life, like Heather was saying, means that we aren't being present and aware of our current selves, our current bodies. It means we push away truth. And so for someone with high cholesterol, that might look like one more cheeseburger combo. For someone with a target joint in their elbow, it could mean one more basketball game or round of bowling. For some of us, it could mean one last drink at the end of the night. It could mean saying yes to a lot of things that are slowly but surely killing us day in and day out. It's dangerous to believe, like all of us tend to do, that we are going to live forever in these bodies. That aging is something that happens to everyone else but me, until I look in the mirror and am shocked that my beard is graying, because after all, I'm still just 21, right? This season on Let's Talk, we're going to work our way from death to life. We're going to explore growth and adaptation, suffering and celebration, relationships, new experiences, and variations of the birth story. It's going to be a wild ride, but one that we will take together, and it will never get too scary. And we'll always leave with a sense of curiosity that keeps us asking these incredibly valuable questions about how we live, how we die, and what our minds are doing along the way. I'll be back next month, but you can dive deeper on the subject of death next episode as Jessica takes you down the well for a deeper look. Heather and Carter will be there as well, and if you want to get curious about their work between then and now, well...
There's an Instagram for our project. It's Death Differently Doc. And then if people want to follow my work, where I'm updating a lot about like philosophy on death and having conversations about that on Instagram, it's Wisdom and Sage. And if they want to follow the progress of our documentary or assist us in the fundraising, because we would love help, is deathdifferently.org.
And for some wonderful mental health resources, check out letstalkmh.com/resources. Thanks to Heather and Carter, Jessica for chiming in, and Patrick and Amy for giving me a place to talk about these things. Talking can be so healing. I'm climbing back in bed now to rest and secretly practice my movie trailer voice. In a world where mental health matters. I'll see you next time.
Thank you, Josh, for another excellent Let's Talk segment. Visit letstalkmh.com to learn more about Let's Talk. You can also check out the Let's Talk page on the Bloodstream podcast page of bloodstreammedia.com. And of course, thank you to Sanofi for supporting Let's Talk. Share your why. Visit shareyourwhy.com to learn more. Awesome having Adar on. Really happy to be at this conference. We're still here. We're here now. We're still in this Marriott.
We're going to be here for a while.
Like 4 months, I think, or something, right? How long is the conference? Amy, what are listeners going to hear, not in 2 weeks, but next week?
Next week. In 1 week, we're still going to be at HFA.
At least in podcast form, yes.
No, we'll still be at HFA, and we're going to hear from the other keynote speaker, Xander Masser.
That's how he prefers to be identified,
as
by the way.
Other keynote
that's
speaker.
What I asked him earlier. I was like, do you like this? And he's like,
no, I prefer the other keynote speaker. This one is incredible.
Yeah, that was an awesome conversation.
Honestly, I mean, I don't want to build it up too much, but an incredible story, and he is incredible. His name is Xander Masser, and he has a phenomenal exhibit and a book and a talk and a workshop, actually. He has like all of the things.
Going on. Yeah.
He's actually doing multiple things here at HFA. His father had hemophilia and passed away with AIDS, HIV. And he uncovered this treasure trove of photographs. His father...
the exact words that were in my head.
Really?
Yeah, it's like treasure trove. And you said treasure trove.
Oh my gosh. His father was a professional photographer. And anyway, he's going around the country sharing this exhibit and sharing the story of his father. It's extremely powerful.
Yeah.
And, I think it would be powerful if he wasn't connected to the hemophilia community, but having this connection to the hemophilia community, I think is just, in terms of our conference and our conversation today, I mean, it was just really amazing.
So you'll hear that in 1 week.
1 week.
We'll still be here at HFA in podcast
still
form. You'll
here.
Hear from Xander.
Still at a Marriott.
And then it'll be the week after that. You'll hear our Journey to Joint Health panel and some of the voices from that episode or from that session. And that'll be in 2 weeks. But with that, that is all for this episode. But a reminder to subscribe to the Bloodstream podcast wherever you listen and share this episode with friends, family, your postal worker, your DoorDash person, anyone that you may interact with. Although if you're a DoorDash, they may just drop it off at your door. Maybe you don't even interact with. You could leave them a note, subscribe to Bloodstream.
Seriously,
I don't know if it'll be
just to post
effective,
it.
but if you haven't tried, it's worth a shot. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can even stream episodes directly from Facebook.
Amazing.
How great is that?
Order a guest that you're dying to hear from, or you want to inquire about storytelling or casting opportunities for Bloodstream's podcast, or Believe Limited's films, email us at mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com or connect with us on social media. You'll find Bloodstream Media on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or you can follow myself or Patrick James Lynch. It's Patrick James Lynch.
All
Just
three.
FYI.
There's a lot of
on
Patrick Lynches out there.
Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or LinkedIn. Shout out to all the committed LinkedIn users out there, just like me.
I am your host, Patrick James Lynch.
And I'm your other host and Marriott specialist, Amy Ward.
And until next time, take self-care of yourself. We'll be back in a week. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.